Harlem, New York. 9:18 p.m. Friday, March 11, 1960. Outside the Lenox Lounge on Malcolm X Boulevard, the March wind carried the scent of rain and the distant hum of Friday night traffic. Inside, beneath amber lights that cast long shadows across mahogany tables, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, aged bourbon, and the quiet tension that always accompanied respectability in a neighborhood where respect was earned in blood. This was not a dive bar for the desperate. This was an institution where Harlem's elite broke bread with politicians, jazz legends, and the men who controlled the streets with surgical precision. At a corner table near the piano sat Mame Johnson, 73 years old, wearing her best navy dress and the pearl earrings she reserved for special occasions. Her back was straight, her hands folded over her small purse, her church hat positioned with the dignity of a woman who had survived Jim Crow, buried children, and raised a son the newspapers called a monster, but the neighborhood called necessary. To strangers, she was simply an elderly woman enjoying her Friday dinner. To everyone else in that room, she was the mother of the most dangerous man in New York City. 20 feet away, at the mahogany bar, Charles Whitman III swayed on unsteady legs. White. 42 years old. Investment banker from Connecticut who had driven into Harlem with 3 colleagues seeking what he called the authentic experience. His Brooks Brothers suit cost more than most families in the neighborhood earned in 6 months. His words slurred together like melting ice. His tie hung loose around his neck like a noose waiting to tighten. His colleagues had tried twice to convince him to leave. He had ignored them both times. Mame Johnson had cleaned white people's homes for 40 years. She had fled South Carolina after watching her husband beaten nearly to death for looking at a white woman. She had raised Ellsworth alone in a Harlem tenement, teaching him that dignity was the only thing poverty couldn't steal and respect was the only currency that mattered. She sat at that corner table every Friday at 9:15 p.m., waiting for her son to finish his business and escort her home at exactly 10:30 p.m. It was a ritual that had continued unbroken for 12 years. Charles Whitman ordered his 5th bourbon. Neat. The bartender, a man named Samuel who had known the Johnson family since 1948, served it without enthusiasm. Whitman turned from the bar, glass in hand, scanning the room with the particular arrogance of men who mistake money for immunity. His eyes landed on Mame's table, an elderly black woman. Alone. Quiet. The perfect target for a man whose racism was lubricated by alcohol and insulated by privilege. What happened next took 11 seconds and changed 2 lives forever. Whitman stumbled toward her table, bourbon sloshing in his glass. His colleagues called his name. The piano player's fingers hesitated on the keys. Samuel reached for the phone behind the bar. But Whitman was already there, standing 3 feet from Mame Johnson, looking down at her with the cold calculation of a man who had never faced consequences for his cruelty. He spoke first, a racial slur delivered with casual brutality, followed by words that made 63 people stop breathing. What's this old-colored bitch doing in the good section? Then he threw his drink. The bourbon hit Mame's face and chest, soaking the navy dress she had saved 4 months to buy. Amber liquid dripped from her chin onto the white tablecloth, pooling like spilled blood under the yellow lights. The room went silent. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of calculation. Every person present knew exactly what Mame's last name meant. They knew her son was 2 blocks away at the Cotton Club, conducting business. They knew he visited his mother every Friday at 9:30 p.m., which meant he would walk through that door in exactly 12 minutes. Mame Johnson didn't scream. She didn't stand. She didn't speak. She simply reached into her purse, pulled out a white handkerchief, and began dabbing bourbon from her face with the mechanical precision of someone who had survived worse humiliations and understood that dignity meant endurance. At 9:30 p.m., the door opened. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson walked into the Lenox Lounge wearing a black overcoat and carrying the evening newspaper. He was 55 years old. He had survived 6 prison sentences, 19 assassination attempts, and a war with the Italian families that left 42 men dead. He controlled every numbers runner, policy bank, and protection racket from 110th Street to the Harlem River. But none of that mattered when he saw his mother's ruined dress. Charles Whitman III would disappear 72 hours later. His body would be found in the Hudson River with his fingers broken and a note pinned to his chest, "Respect is not negotiable." E.J., his colleagues, would tell police they lost him somewhere in Harlem. The investigation would be closed within a week. The story of how Charles Whitman III lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to March 11th, 1960, and understand exactly what happens when you pour a drink on Bumpy Johnson's mother. Mame Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1887, when the embers of the Civil War still smoldered in every interaction between black and white Americans. By the time she reached 16, she had witnessed 3 lynchings. The first was a farmhand accused of stealing chickens. The second was a schoolteacher who had dared to use books intended for white children. The third was her uncle, dragged from his bed at midnight because a white woman claimed he had looked at her with insufficient deference. Mame learned that in the American South, survival meant silence, dignity meant endurance, and justice was a luxury black people could not afford. In 1905, she married Samuel Johnson, a railroad worker who believed education and hard work could overcome the limitations white society imposed. Those dreams ended on a Tuesday afternoon when Samuel made the fatal mistake of defending a black woman being harassed by 3 white men outside the Charleston train station. They beat him with iron pipes until his skull cracked and his ribs shattered. He survived, but the spinal damage left him unable to work. The sheriff called it a misunderstanding and closed the case within 48 hours. Mame made her decision that night. She sold everything they owned, borrowed money from her church, and bought 2 train tickets north. They arrived in Harlem in September 1905 with $17 and the clothes on their backs. Samuel died 6 months later from complications related to his injuries. Mame was 18 years old, pregnant, and alone in a city that promised opportunity but delivered poverty with systematic precision. She gave birth to Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in October 1906 in a tenement on 135th Street where rats outnumbered residents and winter cold killed infants with casual regularity. She raised him alone, working as a domestic servant for white families in Manhattan who paid her $3 a week to clean their homes while treating her like furniture that occasionally spoke. Mame would leave their tenement at 5 in the morning and return at 8 at night, her hands raw from lye soap and her back bent from scrubbing floors. But she never missed a night reading to Ellsworth from the Bible and the few books she could afford. She taught him that violence without purpose was the behavior of animals, but violence with precision was the language of survival. She explained that respect was not given freely in a world designed to humiliate black people, so it had to be taken and defended with absolute commitment. She did not raise a gangster. She raised a protector. The streets made the rest. By 1948, Mame Johnson had evolved beyond being simply Bumpy's mother. She had become a community matriarch who mediated disputes between neighbors, counseled young mothers struggling with poverty, and commanded respect that existed independent of her son's reputation. When families fought over property lines, they came to Mame. When husbands beat their wives, the women came to Mame, and the husbands would find themselves visited by men who explained the consequences of continued violence through broken fingers and shattered kneecaps. The Friday night dinners began in 1948 and continued unbroken for 12 years. Every Friday at exactly 9:15, Mame would sit at the same corner table in the Lenox Lounge, wearing her best dress and waiting for her son to finish his business and escort her home at 10:30. It was Bumpy's way of showing Harlem that family came before money, before territory, before power. In a world where organized crime demanded absolute loyalty to business above all else, Bumpy Johnson stopped his empire every Friday night to have dinner with his mother. The navy dress had cost $43. Mame had saved for 4 months, setting aside $2 from each week's cleaning wages, purchasing it piece by piece with money earned on her knees in strangers' kitchens. It represented everything she had survived and everything she had built. Dignity in a world designed to strip it away. Self-respect in a society that told black women they were worth less than the floors they scrubbed. When Bumpy walked through the door at 9:30 and saw the bourbon stains spreading across that navy dress like blood across a crime scene, he did not run to her. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked to her table with the mechanical precision of a man entering a different state of consciousness. When he reached her side, he knelt down so his face was level with hers. The entire room leaned forward, 63 people holding their breath, waiting to hear what the most dangerous man in New York would say to his mother. Bumpy Johnson looked at the bourbon dripping from her chin, at the ruined dress she had saved 4 months to buy, at the quiet humiliation in her eyes that no amount of dignity could completely hide. Then he asked one question in a whisper, so quiet the room went silent trying to hear it. Who? Charles Whitman III was born in Greenwich, Connecticut in 1918, into a world where consequences were theoretical concepts that applied to other people. His grandfather had built a railroad fortune during the Gilded Age. His father had multiplied it through strategic board positions and political connections that reached into the highest levels of state government. By 1960, Charles was a senior associate at Morgan Stanley, a position secured not through merit but through a phone call from his father to an old Yale rowing teammate. His trust fund generated more income annually than most American families earned in 5 years. His racism was not casual prejudice, but systematic cruelty reinforced by decades of immunity. In 1953, he slapped a black hotel maid in Atlanta for entering his room without knocking twice. She reported it. Within 24 hours, his father's legal team paid her $200 and secured a signed waiver. The incident disappeared. In 1956, at a Manhattan restaurant, he pushed a black waiter so hard the man fractured his wrist, hitting the floor. Management apologized to Charles. The waiter was fired for carelessness. In 1958, at a Miami resort, he cornered a black chambermaid and grabbed her arm when she tried to walk away from his comments. The resort banned him temporarily, then welcomed him back 2 months later with a complimentary suite after quiet financial arrangements. Each incident taught him the same lesson: his whiteness and wealth created an impenetrable shield. Black service workers existed as props in his private theater of humiliation. He had never met a black person who could challenge him. He had never entered a space where his money meant less than his behavior. On March 11, 1960, Charles closed a $4.2 million municipal bond deal for Newark. His supervisor suggested celebrating at the Yale Club. Charles suggested something different. He wanted to venture into what he called the jungle, to experience authentic Harlem before returning to his sanitized Connecticut existence. 3 colleagues agreed to join him, though 2 expressed reservations about entering a neighborhood where their skin color made them targets rather than authorities. They arrived at the Lenox Lounge at 8:45. Charles began drinking with systematic determination, using alcohol to amplify existing personality defects rather than mask them. By his 4th bourbon, he was commenting loudly about the neighborhood, using racial slurs casually, treating the establishment like a zoo where he could observe dangerous animals from behind his economic privilege. His colleagues tried twice to convince him to leave. He ignored them both times. When Bumpy Johnson walked through the door at 9:30, Charles barely noticed. He was too busy recounting his assault on Mame Johnson to his colleagues, describing how the old woman had just sat there taking it, how easy it was to remind these people of their place. His colleagues were not laughing. They were staring past him toward the door, their faces drained of color. One grabbed his arm and whispered urgently that they needed to leave immediately, that the man with the old woman was Bumpy Johnson, and they had just witnessed something that would have consequences. Charles dismissed the warning with a laugh. He was still laughing when Bumpy escorted his mother out at 9:47. He was still drinking when Bumpy stopped at the bar, leaned close to Samuel, and spoke 4 words that made the bartender's hands shake. Then Bumpy handed Samuel a folded piece of paper and walked into the March night. Samuel waited until the door closed before opening the note. His hands trembled as he read the contents. 2 lines written in precise handwriting, an address and a time that would end a life and begin a legend. Pier 47. Sunday. 3 a.m. Bumpy Johnson did not believe in impulsive violence. Emotion clouded judgment, and clouded judgment created witnesses, detectives, and problems that multiplied like cancer through an organization. His reputation was built on precision. When a line was crossed, he did not swing blindly. He investigated. He cataloged. He built a complete map of his target's life, then chose exactly where to apply pressure so that the punishment did not just hurt, it educated. At 7 o'clock Saturday morning, less than 12 hours after bourbon had stained his mother's navy dress, Bumpy was already working. While most of Harlem slept off its Friday night, he sat in a rented back room above a bakery on 135th Street. One by one, his informants came through the door. They represented 5 boroughs and 3 social classes. A clerk from a downtown bank who owed Bumpy for clearing his brother's gambling debt in 1952. A numbers runner who spent half his day in midtown office buildings collecting bets from secretaries and junior executives. A patrolman from the 28th Precinct who supplemented his city salary with discreet information sales. A porter from Grand Central who watched men like Charles Whitman travel between worlds with arrogant confidence. By 8:15, Bumpy had Whitman's full name. By 10 o'clock, he had the Greenwich home address at 42 Lake Avenue, the make and model of his car, his wife Patricia's name, his daughter's school, his office location, and the floor of Morgan Stanley where he worked. By 1 in the afternoon, he knew Whitman's salary of $42,000 annually, his trust fund income of approximately $120,000, and the golf club where he conducted off-the-record conversations with judges and local politicians. By 3 in the afternoon, he understood Whitman's habits: the 7:14 morning train from Greenwich, lunch at the Yale Club on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and how he spoke to black service workers when he believed no one important was listening. The pattern emerged quickly. 3 official complaints buried inside Morgan Stanley's legal department, each one involving a black employee in a service role. June 1954, a waiter at a midtown steakhouse pushed to the ground and kicked in the ribs. November 1956, A janitor slapped for getting in his way outside an elevator bank. March 1958, a hotel maid in Atlanta hospitalized with a concussion after being shoved into a marble sink. Each case followed the same formula. A complaint was filed. A quiet settlement was arranged. A legal waiver was signed. No public record remained. Bumpy read each report twice. This was not a man who had made a single drunken mistake. This was a predator operating under the protection of money and race, selecting victims he believed could never retaliate. The response required could not be simple violence. It had to be total architectural deconstruction. His philosophy on revenge was systematic. You start with the foundation, a man's sense of safety. Then you attack the structure, his professional reputation. Finally, you destroy the roof, his family's security. Only when the house is collapsing do you walk in and deliver the final blow. Punishment without purpose was noise. Proper revenge was instruction that taught entire communities what happened when sacred lines were crossed. Sunday afternoon at 4, in a basement on 135th Street, Bumpy met with 4 trusted lieutenants around a scarred wooden table. He laid out Whitman's life with clinical clarity, his financial vulnerabilities, his professional insecurities, his dependence on reputation, his marriage held together by appearances. The plan was not to simply kill him. Death was too quick. First, they would dismantle his illusion of safety through escalating psychological pressure. Then they would contaminate his professional world through orchestrated client withdrawals. Finally, they would send direct messages that his family was within reach. At 11:43 Sunday night, Charles Whitman answered his home telephone after the 3rd ring. No one spoke. He listened, irritation rising, about to hang up. Then he heard his own voice played back with brutal clarity. "What's this old colored bitch doing in the goods section?" The recording clicked off. The line went dead. For the first time in his life, Charles understood that someone had been listening when he thought he was untouchable. Monday at 8:15 a.m., Charles Whitman stepped off the elevator onto the 22nd floor of Morgan Stanley, expecting congratulations for closing the Newark bond deal. Instead, his supervisor, Arthur Sterling, waited outside his office with the tight expression of a man delivering terminal diagnosis. 3 major clients had pulled their accounts overnight: the Vanderbilt Trust, Harrison Estate, and Consolidated Construction of New Jersey. Combined value, $6.2 million under management. No explanation provided. No warning given. Just withdrawal requests submitted through their attorneys before most of Manhattan had finished breakfast. What Whitman did not understand was that these were not random departures. In the 1950s, when white businessmen needed access to Harlem properties, labor crews, and protection during strikes, they went through intermediaries who eventually led them to Bumpy Johnson. He arranged security during labor disputes, ensured construction sites remained untouched by thieves, and guaranteed workers received their wages on time. In exchange, he collected fees and stored something more valuable than cash: leverage. Now, 15 years later, those markers were being called in with surgical timing. When Bumpy Johnson made a request, these men did not ask questions. They simply acted. By 2:30 Monday afternoon, the strategy shifted from financial to personal. Whitman walked to the Morgan Stanley parking garage to find his Lincoln Continental vandalized with systematic precision. All 4 tires slashed. Windshield shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. Most significantly, the word respect had been carved into the hood with something sharp enough to cut through metal and paint. Security was apologetic, but useless. The cameras covering that specific section had malfunctioned for exactly 19 minutes between 2:15 and 2:34. No footage existed. No witnesses came forward. The precision of the timing demonstrated access that money alone could not buy. Tuesday morning brought escalation that crossed from professional into deeply personal territory. At 9 o'clock, a plain manila envelope arrived at Whitman's office with no return address. Inside was his daughter Caroline's private school schedule with certain times circled in red ink. 8:15 arrival, 12:30 lunch period, 3 o'clock dismissal. Beneath the schedule was a black and white photograph of his wife Patricia leaving the Greenwich Country Club the previous afternoon. Completely unaware someone was documenting her movements. Clipped to these items was a single white handkerchief, identical to the one Mame Johnson had used to dab bourbon from her face 4 nights earlier. No note accompanied the package. None was necessary. By noon, panic had finally cracked Whitman's arrogance. He drove to NIPT headquarters, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to file a report. The detective assigned was Marcus Washington, a 20-year veteran with eyes that had seen every variety of white privilege and the violence it produced. Whitman stumbled through a vague account. Anonymous calls, unexplained vandalism, threatening mail. He omitted the central event because admitting what he had done in Harlem would require acknowledging not only his guilt, but the identity of the man whose mother he had humiliated. When Whitman mentioned the name Johnson in connection with Harlem, Washington's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He promised to look into it, knowing exactly what was happening and understanding that police reports could not stop Bumpy Johnson once a process like this had begun. Tuesday night found Whitman drinking alone in a Stamford bar, 20 miles from Greenwich, trying to convince himself that distance meant safety. At 10:16, a well-dressed black man sat on the stool beside him, ordered bourbon neat, and said nothing for several minutes. Then he slid a folded cocktail napkin across the scarred wood. Written in block letters was an address and a time that made Whitman's blood turn to ice: Lenox Lounge, Malcolm X Boulevard. Friday, 9:18 p.m. You remember, the man finished his drink, left cash on the bar, and walked out without looking back. Wednesday morning, driven by a fatal combination of fear and stubborn arrogance, Whitman made the decision that sealed his fate. Instead of seeking to apologize, instead of attempting to make amends for his cruelty, he contacted 2 men from Boston with reputations for discreet violence. He wired $5,000 as a down payment to eliminate his Harlem problem. The contractors took his money, assured him the situation would be resolved within 48 hours, and drove south Wednesday afternoon with confidence built on 20 successful contracts across New England. Thursday morning, their bodies were discovered floating in the East River, hands bound, eyes open, as if still trying to understand how they had become part of someone else's lesson in respect. Thursday at 6:30 p.m., exactly 1 week to the minute after bourbon had stained his mother's navy dress, Charles Whitman's home telephone rang with the mechanical precision of a courthouse bell. He answered on the second ring, his voice betraying 7 days of systematic psychological demolition. The voice on the other end belonged to someone he did not recognize, but the tone was unmistakable, calm, measured, devoid of anger or threat. It was the voice of a man who understood that true power never needed volume, only certainty. The message was delivered with surgical clarity. Whitman had 2 choices and 12 hours to decide. Choice 1, come to Harlem alone Friday night, walk into the Lenox Lounge at exactly 9:18 p.m., and face consequences like a man who understood he had crossed sacred lines. Choice 2, refuse, stay hidden behind Connecticut privilege and Greenwich security systems, and watch his family pay the educational price his cowardice and racism had earned. The voice did not elaborate on what that price might entail, The photographs of his daughter's school schedule and his wife leaving the country club had already demonstrated reach that no amount of wealth could prevent. The line went dead before Whitman could respond, leaving him alone with a choice constructed with the cruel precision of a trap designed to strip away every layer of protection his 42 years had provided. If he stayed, he risked Patricia and Caroline. If he went, he risked himself. For the first time in his life, money could not buy an exit strategy. Connections could not generate a phone call to make problems disappear. His whiteness offered no shield in a conflict where the rules had been rewritten by men who understood power in ways Wall Street never taught. Friday at 7:45 p.m., Charles Whitman began what he understood would likely be his final drive. He left Greenwich alone as instructed, his Lincoln Continental carrying him south through neighborhoods that transformed with each passing mile. The manicured lawns and iron gates of Connecticut gave way to industrial zones, then tenements, then the heart of Harlem itself. For the first time in his existence, he entered territory where his skin color was not armor but target, where his money meant less than the content of his character, where the social contract that had protected him since birth simply did not exist. The streets that had entertained him a week earlier as a tourist seeking authentic experience now felt like enemy territory. Every face on the sidewalk seemed to know why he was there. Every corner held potential danger. His expensive Brooks Brothers suit felt like a costume advertising vulnerability. His car felt like a beacon announcing the arrival of the man who had thrown bourbon on Bumpy Johnson's mother. The arrogance that had sustained him through 4 decades of unchallenged privilege had been replaced by primal fear that tasted like copper in his mouth. At 9:18 p.m. exactly, 1 week to the minute since the incident, Charles Whitman pushed open the heavy wooden door of the Lenox Lounge. The room was identical to the previous Friday. Same amber lights casting long shadows across mahogany tables. Same scent of cigarette smoke and aged bourbon. Same jazz piano providing understated soundtrack. But the atmosphere had transformed completely. Conversation stopped the moment he entered. 63 pairs of eyes turned toward him with expressions that mixed curiosity, judgment, and expectation. They had all been there. They had all witnessed. Now they waited for the reckoning that history demanded. Bumpy Johnson sat at a center table, wearing the same black overcoat he had worn the previous Friday. Mame was not present. This was deliberate. Tonight was not her burden to witness, but his to carry. Bumpy did not stand when Whitman entered. He did not gesture or call out. He simply waited until Whitman's legs carried him forward through the silent room, each step an admission that he had entered territory governed by laws he did not understand. When Whitman reached the table, what followed was not a threat, but an education delivered in a voice so calm it was more terrifying than any scream. Bumpy explained the rules Whitman had broken, not the statutes written in downtown courthouses, but the codes that governed communities the legal system ignored. He described the disrespect shown to a 73-year-old woman whose only crime was existing while black in a space where a drunk white man believed he had authority. He outlined why the lesson being taught tonight was not personal revenge, but community protection, a demonstration that would echo through Harlem and beyond, reminding everyone that some lines carried consequences no amount of privilege could erase. Then Bumpy laid 3 photographs on the table with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. The Manhattan waiter from 1956, ribs broken, fired from his job for filing a complaint. The Atlanta hotel maid from 1958, concussion severe enough to require hospitalization, paid off and silenced by lawyers who treated justice like a commodity. The building janitor from 1954, humiliated in front of colleagues, forced to sign away his rights for $200. Bumpy's voice remained level as he explained that power without accountability was not strength, but organized cowardice. that men who built their self-worth on the humiliation of those who could not fight back were not men at all, but parasites feeding on a system designed to protect their cruelty. Finally, Bumpy offered Whitman one final choice, delivered with the cold finality of a closing argument. He could apologize publicly to Mame Johnson, on his knees, in front of every person who had witnessed the disrespect. He could admit his racism, acknowledge his pattern of abuse, and then leave New York forever, never to return. Or he could refuse, and face the alternative that his hired contractors from Boston had already experienced in the East River. For 37 seconds, Whitman's pride wrestled with his survival instinct. The toxic accumulation of 42 years of entitlement rose in his throat. To kneel before a black woman, in a black neighborhood, in front of black witnesses represented a surrender his psychology could not process. He looked at the floor. He looked at Bumpy's empty, merciless eyes. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, sealed his fate. At exactly 37 seconds, Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket one final time and placed a photograph on the table face down. Then he slid it across the mahogany surface with deliberate slowness. Whatever image Whitman saw when he turned it over drained every trace of color from his face and made his hands begin shaking uncontrollably. His breath stopped. His pupils dilated. In that instant, he understood with absolute clarity that some debts were too large for apologies, some lessons could only be taught in blood, and some choices once delayed were no longer choices at all. The photograph showed his daughter Caroline leaving school that very afternoon, the timestamp proving it had been taken less than 6 hours earlier. This was not threat, but demonstration of operational capability extending beyond Harlem into the protected suburbs of Connecticut. In that moment, Charles Whitman faced the most direct choice of his existence: kneel before a black woman and beg forgiveness, or die standing in defiance. 42 years of toxic conditioning made the decision for him. His racism was not merely prejudice, but the fundamental architecture of his identity. Even with death waiting in the basement below, his psychology could not permit the surrender. Pride killed Charles Whitman more efficiently than any bullet ever could. What occurred between 10:30 p.m. and 2 a.m. in the basement of the Lenox Lounge was not random brutality, but systematic education. Bumpy's justice operated on two levels simultaneously: personal revenge for the bourbon thrown on his mother's face, and instructional demonstration for the community he protected. The lesson was delivered with surgical precision. Each broken finger corresponded to a documented assault Whitman had committed against black service workers who could not retaliate. The hotel maid in Atlanta, the waiter in Manhattan, the janitor by the elevator bank. This was not torture born of rage, but systematic deconstruction administered by men who understood that some lessons could only be taught through pain, and some messages required permanent delivery. Sunday morning at 6:47, two dock workers arriving at Pier 47 discovered Charles Whitman's body floating face down in the Hudson River. His expensive Brooks Brothers suit clung to skin already turning the gray-blue color of death by drowning. His fingers had been systematically broken, each one snapped with deliberate care. Pinned to his chest with a brass tack was a white note card, the message written in perfect cursive: "Respect is not negotiable." The signature was simply initials that everyone in 5 boroughs would recognize: E.J. The police investigation that followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic indifference. Detective Marcus Washington, the same officer who had taken Whitman's vague complaint days earlier, filed reports with appropriate diligence while arriving at conclusions that satisfied administrative requirements without threatening anyone important. No witnesses came forward. No evidence pointed toward specific suspects. The case remained technically open but practically dormant. Bumpy's connections extended deep into law enforcement through decades of strategic relationships, ensuring that some deaths were investigated just thoroughly enough to avoid scrutiny while changing nothing fundamental about the power structure operating beneath official recognition. Word of Whitman's fate spread through both worlds with the velocity of legend building itself in real time. In Harlem, the story became protective parable, reminding everyone that Bumpy Johnson defended his community with absolute commitment. Downtown, in boardrooms and private clubs where men like Whitman conducted business, the message landed with equal impact. Within 6 months, 3 wealthy white men with previous Harlem incidents quietly left New York. A Morgan Stanley vice president transferred to Chicago, citing family reasons. A real estate developer relocated to Boston. A hedge fund manager moved his entire operation to Connecticut. They understood what Charles Whitman had learned too late. Some neighborhoods operated under their own constitution, enforced by men who valued respect more than life itself. The broader impact extended far beyond individual departures. For years afterward, assaults on black service workers in and around Harlem dropped measurably. The legend of Charles Whitman III became cautionary tale, protecting countless black women from similar humiliations, not through legal reform, but through brutal clarity of consequences delivered with systematic precision. Friday night, exactly 2 weeks after bourbon had stained her navy dress, Mame Johnson returned to the Lenox Lounge. She wore a new dress, navy blue, identical in style to the ruined one. She sat at the same corner table at 9:15 p.m., her back straight, her hands folded over her small purse, her dignity intact and reinforced by recent events. The bourbon stains were gone, but the memory remained, carved into Harlem's collective consciousness like scripture written in blood and consequence. At 9:30, Bumpy walked through the door carrying the evening newspaper. He sat across from his mother without speaking, and they shared dinner in comfortable silence while 63 people watched with expressions mixing reverence and relief. In Harlem, respect was not requested through polite conversation or legal petitions. It was required, enforced, and defended with absolute commitment that built kingdoms in neighborhoods the government had abandoned. For Charles Whitman III, one careless drink had taught him the difference between power and consequences, between privilege and justice, between the immunity he believed wealth provided and the accountability that men like Bumpy Johnson delivered without hesitation or mercy. The lesson had come too late to save his life, but it arrived in time to save countless others from the cruelty men like him inflicted when they believed the world belonged to them alone.